Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Shooters Outpost Museum in Hooksett, New Hampshire, taking a look at a Soviet SG43 Goryunov heavy machine gun. This was sort of the emergency, plans have gone terribly wrong and we need a new machine gun for the Soviets in the Second World War. So in the 1930s, as war was approaching, the Soviet Union, the Red Army, recognized that it was going to need a gun to replace their 1910 Maxim heavy machine guns. The Maxim was a great gun, but it was really heavy. It was water-cooled, which was kind of falling out of favor by that point, and it was an incredibly expensive gun to manufacture. The Maxim was the first practical machine gun, and like all first-generation guns, it was really complex. And so the Soviet Union had gone through about almost a 10-year development program to replace it, and they were replacing it with something that was much more modern, and that was the DS-39 universal machine gun. It was an air-cooled gun. It could be fired from a variety of mountings. You could put it easily on a vehicle, anti-aircraft mountings, infantry mountings. It was going to be great. Fired the same 7.62 by 54 rimmed cartridge using the same belt as the Maxim guns. And these went into production in 1940, and they went into the field in the Winter War, and things went terribly awry. The gun had a lot of trouble in the field. So much so that production was actually cut off after they'd made just over 10,000 of them. And they went back to the 1910 Maxim. Now, this was a significant problem. They needed something to fill this role and replace the Maxim gun. And it would actually take a couple of years. There was an attempt to rebuild the Degtyarev, the DS-39, to fix its issues, but ultimately in 1942, the Soviet Army the Red Army, put out a request, competition essentially, for a new heavy machine gun. Now, to back up a couple of years, we have a young gun designer named Peter Maximovich Goryunov, and he was working at the Kovrov Arsenal. He had actually worked under Degtyarev. In 1940, working with two colleagues, he started working on what was actually intended to be a new light machine gun design, something that theoretically would replace the Degtyarev DP-27 light machine guns. And his two colleagues in this were a guy named Voronkov and a guy named Goryunov. It was actually Peter Maximovich Goryunov and his cousin Mikhail Goryunov, both working on this gun. The gun would eventually be designated the GVG, Goryunov, Voronkov, Goryunov. Now, it was going to be a light machine gun, so it had a lot of stamped parts, but it was also intended to be a very simple and economical gun to manufacture. The design originates in 1940. They do some iterative work. 1941, it's first demonstrated. 1942, it actually goes through some testing, and things go pretty well. And then in 1942 comes this Soviet Army request for a new heavy machine gun. And at that point, Goryunov looks at his light machine gun and figures the core mechanics are good enough. Like, it's chambered for the 7.62 by 54 cartridge already. So they go ahead and redesign this gun a bit into a heavy machine gun for the new trials. And that's where it takes on this form. So the stamped receiver turns into a milled receiver to make the whole thing more durable. They give it a much heavier barrel for more sustained fire, because it's intended to be fired basically from a Sokolov mount, from the same sort of heavy mounting that the Maxim guns are used on. So portability isn't really a consideration. When this was all done, the final weight of the gun would come to 88 pounds on a Sokolov mount. So, easy to add a few pounds to a barrel to give it more sustained fire capability. The gun is tested fairly quickly. The first production batch is scheduled for December of 1942. It's produced by March of 1943, and the guns start going through actual trials and doing really well. And that sort of becomes an issue because, as I understand it, and there's a little bit of uncertainty in this, I'm basing this account on a book by a guy named Boletin. What he describes is that the Soviets were attempting to improve the DS-39, and they had trials between the improved DS-39 and the new Goryunov, what would become the SG43 machine guns. But there's some question. It might have been actually trials against the Maxim gun. At any rate, the Goryunov does really well, and Stalin's kind of suspicious of this. Stalin actually took a personal interest in a lot of the small arms design that was going on in the Soviet Union, and the problem he had was he looked at these two designers. He's got this new kid named Goryunov that hasn't ever produced anything, that no one's really heard of, who apparently has come up with a gun that is better than, depending on which version of this story is true, better than either the Maxim gun or better than Degtярev's gun. And Degtyarev is a very well-respected designer. He's already put together the DP-27 machine guns. He's going to go on to do several other guns for the Red Army. He's smart. Stalin knows he's smart. And yet somehow this new kid does something better. And that seems weird. And it appears that this was preventing the Goryunov gun from actually being adopted until Degtyarev himself actually was approached by Stalin, and Degtyarev basically said, yeah, that Goryunov gun's the better thing to put into production. Like, it really is good. We should use it. There was a sort of a spirit of camaraderie here. Of course, this is the middle of World War II, and the army urgently needs the best possible weaponry it can get. So simple patriotism says, working together to get the best gun is more important than getting my name on the gun that gets issued, especially when the one that Degtyarev had designed had some serious issues. At any rate, with Degtyarev's specific approval, Stalin accedes to it, and the gun is adopted in May of 1943 as the SG43 new heavy machine gun. So let's take a look at how it works, because it's a really effective, simple design. The markings on the gun, to start with, are on the top of the feed cover here. We have the Kovrov Arsenal symbol there. This translates into Pulymet Goryunova, or Goryunov machine gun. A little bit interesting that the name is actually inscribed on the gun. That's not typical of a lot of Soviet small arms. Then we have a serial number, and we have the date. This is a 1944 production gun, so right in the heat of World War II production. The rear sight folds down, so we can take that, lift it up to use, and this is a ladder style of sight. A little sticky there, but push in this button on the side, and you can slide it up and down, and then there is also micrometer elevation to it, and on the side here, we have a windage adjustment. So the sight itself is a small square notch that is paired with a front sight, very much like that on the DP-27 Degtyarevs. We have a round post in there that can be screwed up and down for elevation adjustment, and sits in a dovetail so it can be moved side to side for windage adjustment. The gun has a very simple conical flash hider. It has an adjustable gas regulator here. You would grab this side, loosen it with a wrench, and then you can actually push the gas regulator out, rotate it to one of these three positions, locked in place by that pin, and then tighten it back down. You can see the gas tube right here. This is the end of the gas block, and that is the beginning of the gas tube. The Goryunov feeds from the right. Interestingly, early prototypes fed from the left, and that was one of the things they specifically revised during the trials and development. It will spit out the empty belt on this side, and this interestingly shaped piece here is actually the ejection port. So we'll get to that in a moment. The mounting points on the Goryunov are spaced and sized identical to those on the 1910 Maxim gun, so that this can drop onto all the same mounts that a Maxim gun would use. And then for firing controls, we have a butterfly trigger back here with a manual safety. So the safety just locks the trigger, push that up, and then you can push the trigger in to fire. Spade grips for controlling the gun, and the bottom grip here is actually the charging handle. Non-reciprocating, pull it back, locks the gun open, you're ready to fire. Actually a pretty cool design, I think, especially for use in vehicles or behind, this allows the gunner to remain pretty much steadily behind the gun and never have to worry about going out around the side, except when they're reloading. We can really get an appreciation for the simplicity of the gun by opening it up. we've got a pair of tabs right there. Lift that back, and we can open this up. The construction of the top cover actually looks quite a lot like the RP-46 top covers that would come after the war. So we have a spring-loaded arm here that is going to push cartridges down into the feedway. So this is the stop that prevents the belt from going backwards. The actual feed pawl is right here. So it's spring-loaded so that when it'll pull a belt in, and then when it reciprocates back out, it snaps down under the belt and then lifts up to catch the next cartridge. So when I cycle the bolt manually, you can see this is going to pull a belt in. This little arm, little pair of fingers, is going to grab a cartridge when it comes in. This is synchronized with the belt feed. So once the belt's in position, this comes forward. These two little arms are spring-loaded. We'll pull this out in a moment. That's going to grab a cartridge, and then when the gun cycles back again, it will pull the cartridge back. We have an open slot here where this spring-loaded arm from the top cover will then push that cartridge down in front of the bolt into the feedway and feed into the gun. So I can lift up the actual feed tray here as well, and you can see the movement of the bolt. So let's bring that back a little bit so you can see it better. As the bolt goes backward, it's going to pull the feed pawl in. One really interesting element here is that this bolt actually locks into the side of the receiver. So at the end of travel, right there, you can see this tilt into the side to lock. There are really not very many guns that do that, and the Goryunov is one of them. So that's the bolt fully locked open. Goryunov disassembly is really easy, which is pretty cool. We're going to start with this big pin with a hook on it and everything. You do want to make sure the bolt's forward when you do this, and you also need to hold on to the pistol grips or the spade grips when you do it. But this pin comes out, and it has a detent on it, so you can actually leave it in the gun. There we go. When it's fully out, the grips will come back. There's a little lug here, so when you put this in, you kind of tilt it in and lift up, and that lug takes a lot of the pressure. So there is our main spring, its guide rod, and the spade grip assembly. Once those are out of the gun, I can then use the charging handle to, let's lift up we'll get this out of the way. We can then use the charging handle to pull the gas piston, bolt carrier, bolt, and the charging handle itself is this long sheet metal piece that just sits on the bottom of the bolt carrier assembly. We can also pull out a few pieces of the feed system. So the feed pawl just slides right out of the gun there. It has a pair of angled lugs that cause it to cycle in and out. Those lugs run on that track on the bolt carrier. The feed tray houses these two parts. These are basically your feed lips. This is very similar to the feed lip setup you have on a DP-27 Degtyarev magazine. And then this is our little cartridge grabber. So these two arms are pinned there. You can see little springs under them back there. And so they will pivot out. I can just get them to move a little bit there, but they will open up to snap around the rim of a cartridge to pull it backwards out of the belt. Lastly, we have a little plate right here that I can tap out. This is what locks the barrel in place. So that groove right there locks around that lug on the barrel. With it out, I can take the barrel out of the gun. So there's its locking catch right there. It's a very large, very heavy barrel. And all of that leaves us with this boxy receiver assembly. The top cover is actually just dovetailed on here, but then it's pinned and staked in place. So not easily removable, easy to assemble. And it leaves just basically a big boxy receiver that it's got a lot of cuts in it, but it's a lot of fairly square cuts, a lot of easy cuts to machine, and way simpler than manufacturing a Maxim gun receiver. I want to point out here, through the ejection port here, right there, you can actually see the locking shoulder, the locking recess in the receiver. And if we look at the outside, you can see that this is a separate piece that's dovetailed in place there as the locking shoulder so that it can be hardened properly and replaced if necessary. If we take a closer look at the bolt assembly, the bolt just lifts right off, and you can see this curved track inside. That is what causes it to pivot. So as the bolt travels in the receiver, the bolt and carrier are lined up like this. When the bolt hits the breech face, it will stop, and as the bolt carrier continues to go forward under it, it pushes the bolt off to the side like this, which causes it to lock up. That's the locking surface right there. And this, of course, fires from an open bolt, and as soon as it is fully locked, the firing pin right there hits this lug right here, and that causes the gun to fire. This would clearly have some influence in, if nothing else, the South African Vector SS-77 design, which worked very similarly. The two tracks here are for the feed pawls. This is actually the sear surface. Now, normally on a gun like this, you would have a sear on the bottom hooking up into the bolt carrier. The Goryunov actually, in an interesting choice of design elements, does it backwards. So the recoil spring, of course, is sitting in here. We'll leave that out for this demonstration. But the guide rod goes into that hole in the bolt carrier, and that is actually the firing sear. So when I press the trigger, it's going to lift that sear up. When the gun is cocked and ready to fire, it sits like this, being held from the inside, and then pulling the trigger. It's a little tricky to do with that trigger safety one-handed, but pulling the trigger lifts that up, which releases the bolt carrier to go forward and fire. Oh, and lastly, on the bolt itself, we have a solid moving ejector here. So what's going to happen is when a cartridge is in the breech face, it pushes the extractor or the ejector back like that. As the bolt starts moving, when it gets to the point where it's time to kick the empty case out of this ejection port, the bolt traveling backwards is going to hit a lug in the receiver that forces that forward, which is going to kick the empty case out to the left from the gunner's perspective and out that ejection port. As soon as it was actually adopted by the military, production wasted no time. By 1944, they had actually supplied enough guns to meet the Army needs, late 44, and they had something like 75,000 of them in wartime reserve, so they were able to bring these up online pretty remarkably quickly, which I think has a lot to do with the simple manufacturing, the fact that this gun is designed to be manufactured quickly and efficiently and easily. It would continue to serve ultimately until it was replaced by the PK, the Kalashnikov Universal Machine Gun, in the early 1960s. It was upgraded after World War II from the SG to the SGM, modernized, which involved a few modifications. Most distinctively, they improved the trigger. They replaced this underside charging handle with a right side, kind of a more traditional, typical charging handle. These are most distinctively recognized, aside from the charging handle, by the barrel. The SGM barrels are fluted to reduce their weight a bit, where the SG43 barrels are the huge, solid, full diameter barrels. They would also adapt these guns to a variety of other uses, in particular tank-mounted guns. So Soviet armored vehicles of the 1950s, for things like coaxial machine guns, would have SGTs or SGMTs, tank versions of the Goryunov, with the spade grips replaced by a solenoid trigger. So all in all, it was a quite successful gun for the Soviet Union. The reason that it was ultimately replaced is it was designed as a heavy machine gun. And by the time we're getting into really the depth of the Cold War, heavy machine guns now need to be a much heavier caliber. Heavy machine gun goes from being a fixed position 30 caliber machine gun to being something more like a 50 caliber or even potentially a little bit larger machine gun, something that's got a little more capability for anti-aircraft use, although that use is waning as aircraft become faster. But the 30 caliber guns, their use trends into much lighter, much more portable infantry guns, and that's where the PK really shines. So this is kind of the Soviet equivalent of the Browning 1919 series. The US, of course, replaced the 1919 with the M60. The Soviets, if you want to look at this as an analogy, they replaced the Goryunovs with PKs to kind of fit that set of roles. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.